Hello, this is Todd Lewis, the host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Here, I'm joined again by Keith Preston, and we're going to discuss World War II. Now, it would be no exaggeration to say that in the popular consciousness and in modern politics, in Europe and the United States, World War II is the seminal event that almost every subsequent political action, political party, explanation of good and evil, and limitless analogies to current events comes from the Second World War. And lots of myths and downright unfactual beliefs have arisen around it. And I feel it's necessary from time to time to revisit the war and reevaluate it. I remember Jeff Riggenbach in his discussion of history said that historical revisionism is the constant effort of historians going back to make sure that history lines up with the facts that actually happened. And oftentimes revisionism is seen as bad, but it's only seen as bad by the court historians, the people that are paid to lie to us by the government to spin a certain narrative. And I think we need to begin with the beginning, and that what were the causes that led to the Second World War. I think consensus has agreed that it was the unequal Treaty of Versailles, which it's in the level of vindictiveness and sadism was quite unusual for European treaties at the time. For instance, the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, and prior to that, the Treaty of Westphalia, and the other treaties that ended European wars between that generally didn't upset the status quo too much. The idea was that we should keep a balance of power. You know, today's enemy could be tomorrow's ally, depending on how the winds of change blow. And so they tended not to be vindictive. But at the end of World War I, for various reasons, the Allies were extremely vindictive and partitioned Germany and completely dismembered the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, and sat by as the Russian Empire itself was dismembered by civil war and revolution. And the so-called war to end all wars really only laid the groundwork for another war. In fact, I think it was there was a French general at Versailles, I forget his name at the moment, but he said that this isn't a peace treaty, but a 20-year truce. And that wasn't too far off the mark, because in 1939, 20 years later, World War II began. But one of the more proximate causes, I think, besides the German revanchism, was the fact that in Eastern and Central Europe, due to the collapse of the Russian and German empires and Austro-Hungarian empires, there was a massive power vacuum in Eastern Europe. And nature abhors a vacuum. And so it was only a matter of time before Germany and Russia would seek to fill that vacuum and then inevitably come to blows over that. And one of the theses that Pat Buchanan has is that had the British not given Poland a war guarantee, which we can get into later, Hitler would have continued moving east and avoided the West entirely. And but this power vacuum, which was created, led to the conflict between Russia and Germany in part. In fact, George Kennan writes that one of the biggest mistakes of World War I was dismembering the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because it did create such a power vacuum that was going to be filled by somebody, either the Germans or, as it actually turned out, the Russians at the end of the Second World War. What do you think about that, Keith?
Well, I think that you're absolutely correct in the sense that what seems to have happened after the First World War is that the Allies imposed terms on Germany that were different, as you pointed out, from earlier peace treaties, and that earlier forms of European warfare between states largely had to do with simple power relationships. It was viewed that different states had their territory, their interests, and when a war was concluded, it was all about settling the terms in a way that's, not unlike the way businesses settle terms of dispute or gangs settle terms of dispute. It just all comes down to allies and interests and geopolitical objectives and things like that. But I think a crucial difference in World War I is the fact that it was to a large degree an ideological war. the fact that the Allies regarded themselves as fighting for the principles of liberalism, democracy, the legacy of the French and American revolutions against what they considered to be these reactionary, backward, monarchist societies like Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, like the Austria-Hungary Empire, like the Ottoman Empire, and even the Tsars in Russia. I think the Allies viewed themselves as fighting not merely a geopolitical war. Well, we have our interest and they have theirs. But instead, it was an ideological war in the sense they thought they were fighting evil. They were, certainly the propaganda of the time depicted it that way. They depicted it as a war to end all wars, because the implicit assumption behind that is that the Germans are responsible for the war, and that's because of their reactionary Prussian monarchist society, and their allies are similar countries with similar values or institutions, and it's all their fault because they're reactionaries who haven't caught up with the modern world, and they're not enlightened, and they're not as liberal as we are, and they're not as democratic as we are. So therefore, if we simply wipe them out and we dismantle these kinds of institutions they have, these more traditional types of institutions, then everything will be fine. There's not going to be any more wars, and in the process, we're making the world safe for democracy, and democracy can spread. It's the same kind of thing on some level that were heard in the lead-ins to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was all about, you had people in the neoconservative camp saying, the real problem in the Middle East is they just don't have a Western style liberal democracy, and we need to make Iraq into a democracy, and then everything will be fine. Or we need democracy in all these other places. Now, there's no doubt a certain amount or a great deal of cynicism in all of those kinds of claims, but it was a very similar situation in World War I, and I think that the Allies had this view at the end of the war that the defeated parties were not just simply defeated parties. They were simply criminals of a type. They were ideological criminals, or they represented the forces of darkness and reaction and benightedness as opposed to progress and enlightenment. And I think that to a large degree accounts for the kinds of harsh terms that were imposed on the Germans at Versailles.
Yeah. I think after the First World War and the fallout that led to and the dismemberment of nations, one of the key problems as a result of that war was the creation of these artificial states that had either never existed, like, say, Czechoslovakia, or had not existed for many centuries, like, say, Poland. And what happened was many of these countries were a kind of ethnic hotbed with people from different countries that didn't want to be in those countries. Like, for instance, the Czechoslovakia, you had the Sudeten Germans, but also you had the Slovak population as well. And the Slovaks and the Sudeten Germans did not like the Moravian Czechs who were head of the government. Poland had some German population in it. Certainly Austria would have voted to join the Germany in a plebiscite in 1918 had such a plebiscite been offered. The Allies, not wanting to strengthen Germany after stripping away all of its land, didn't hold such an election. But a lot of these countries that are artificial, that had no, or if not artificial, had not existed for centuries, were chock full of all these disparate ethnic groups that just couldn't stand each other. And it was kind of this broiling mess. And of course, Hitler capitalized on that by saying that these German people in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, they just want to come home. They just want to be a part of the Greater Reich. And to a large extent, that's correct. A lot of these Germans did want to be a part of Germany and not a part of these nations that were artificial constructions. And again, none of them were very strong. And I think some conflict between Russia and Germany was inevitable as they both tried to reassert control over Eastern Europe. I think the question is, would a war between the West and Germany have been inevitable? Well, I tend to agree with Pat Buchanan that it was not inevitable that the West and Germany would enter into conflict. Had the Polish guarantee not been given to Poland, Hitler would have likely just gone east and avoided the West entirely. And by the time he finally, if he ever did turn back around to the West, they would have had many, many years to prepare, to remilitarize. It would have been would have been in a much better position to defend themselves had they not given the guarantee to Poland. So I think a war between Russia and Germany was almost inevitable, but one between Germany and the West was dependent in large part upon Western actions. What do you think about that?
Well, as far as the issue of a war between Russia and Germany, one of the key factors there was the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, of course. And the interesting thing about that was that the leaders of the Bolshevik movement were influenced by Marxism, and they believed in part that socialism or communism would happen first in the most advanced industrial nations. And at the time, Lenin and Trotsky leaned towards the idea that the real revolution would happen in Germany. They looked at it like Russia was still a feudal, backward, agricultural peasant society, and while they thought they could make a move of accelerating what they viewed as the march towards communism, and they did that with war communism during that period. They also had the idea that they were kind of waiting around for the revolution to happen somewhere else, and they thought it was going to happen in Germany. Because Germany was an advanced industrial society, much more so than Russia. And also, Germany did have a large Marxist movement as well. In fact, they came close to a Marxist revolution at the end of World War I. And by the time of the Nazi Revolution, the communists were actually the second largest party in Germany at the time. But the problem with that is that the Russians, the Bolsheviks, viewed it as their mission to spread the revolution throughout the world. And they were very much in favor of spreading the revolution into Eastern Europe and into Germany. And obviously, unless Germany had actually experienced a Marxist revolution of its own, the Germans, obviously the German state wouldn't have stood for that. So that by itself would have created conflicts between Germany and Russia. And of course, once the Nazis came to power, their whole ideology was that communism, Bolshevism, is the root of all evil. And they viewed it as Jewish, and they thought that Russia was the citadel of Jewish Marxism. And that inevitably, the fact that you had these radical Marxists in power in Russia, and the fact that you had the polar opposite of that, the Nazis in power in Germany, that pretty much guaranteed there was going to be a clash between the two groups. I mean, particularly given the kinds of individuals that were the actual heads of these states. Obviously, the individual personalities play a big role in that as well. But I think you're right that a major error that the Allies, or meaning the Western European nations, made in the lead up to World War II is not the one that's usually given. Like the conventional narrative that certainly these neoconservative people and many other people as well hold to is that the West stood by and they let Hitler get out of control until it was almost too late, and they should have stepped in and nipped it in the bud when the Nazi movement was first growing. I don't really think that's an accurate reading of history. The reading of history that puts all of the blame on Chamberlain at Munich, about how Chamberlain practiced this terrible policy of appeasement supposedly, and he lacked foresight, and even today, even in common language, that's kind of a joke. I've heard it for years. I've heard people just in common language say, "Well, this person must lack the foresight of Chamberlain at Munich." It's just a common phrase for someone who has bad judgment or something like that. But the real issue, though, was that the Germans' actual foreign policy, I'm talking about the Nazis, the Nazi foreign policy was first rooted in the idea of a unified German Reich with all German ethnics, German speakers, the native German speakers, united under the Third Reich. Of course, they wanted to propagate what they thought was the German race. Keep in mind, their idea of race was not the kind of pan-Caucasian idea that the modern white nationalists hold to, but was more of a type of Nordicism that didn't consider Slavs or Poles to be, Aryans or whatever. They certainly didn't consider Russians to be Aryans. But they wanted to obviously expand the size of the German population dramatically. They said they needed living space, what they call Lebensraum. And that was the principal reason for their expansion into Eastern Europe, to accumulate living space for the Reich, and to unite the German people, the ethnic Germans, under the Third Reich as well. And ultimately they saw themselves as being headed for a showdown with the Soviet Union, because they looked at it like, well, over here in the Soviet Union, we've got these supposedly Jewish Bolsheviks that are trying to spread this world communist revolution, whereas from their perspective, they were trying to spread the Nazi revolution. They wanted a vast Central European territory for ethnic Germans. So it was inevitable that the two would clash in that particular way. So I think you're right that there's not really any way that could have been avoided, given the ideological battle that was going on and given the personalities involved. But whether the West made a mistake by failing to so-called nip the Nazi revolution in the bud is a different story. I tend to have a different reading of history that's similar to yours, in the sense that I think that the principal error that the West made was the one you pointed out after World War I, when they carved up all of these former Eastern European empires into these ethno-states that really weren't ethno-states. They were simply artificial borders, and it contained a lot of different kinds of people that had nothing in common. And then when the Germans moved to annex some of these territories, the Rhineland, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Western European powers tried to draw the proverbial line in the sand and say, well, if you keep this expansionism going, we're going to attack you. And ultimately, they couldn't back it up. The Germans and were able to overwhelmingly defeat the French, and after about 6 weeks of fighting, after the French declared war on Germany, and Germany very nearly invaded and occupied England. Now Germany was turned back at the Battle of Britain when they tried to come across the British Channel, but lucky for the English, they were able to turn the Germans back. But this was a disaster for Western Europe, because when the Western Europeans issued the Polish Guarantee and turned and subsequently declared war on Germany over after the invasion of Poland, that in turn opened the door for Germany to invade and occupy the Western European nations, which were not prepared for war at the time. So it was a very poor tactical move for the Western European nations to go act in that kind of provocative way that they did with the Polish Guarantee.
Yeah, exactly. This whole Munich myth, I think, is particularly ridiculous. A.J.P. Taylor, in The Origins of the Second World War, says this about the Munich myth. He says, historians do a bad day's work when they write the appeasers off as stupid or as cowards. They were men confronted with real problems, doing the best in their circumstances of their time. They recognized that an independent and powerful Germany had somehow to be fitted into Europe. Later experience suggests they were right. At any rate, we are still going around to the German problem. Can any sane man suppose, for instance, that other countries could have intervened by armed force in 1933 to overthrow Hitler, when he had come to power by constitutional means and was apparently supported by a large majority of the German people? Could anything have been done trying to make him more popular in Germany, unless perhaps it was intervening to turn him out of the Rhineland in 1936? The Germans put Hitler into power. They were the only ones who could turn him out again. Again, the appeasers feared that the defeat of Germany would be followed by a Russian domination over much of Europe. Later experience suggests they were right here also. Only those who wanted Soviet Russia to take the place of Germany are entitled to condemn the appeasers. And I cannot understand how most of those who condemn them are now unequally indignant at the inevitable result of their failure. And you see, this is really the fallacy of the Munich narrative, is the neocons don't understand Hitler compared to what? What would have happened had there been no strong Germany under Hitler or anybody else. Well, inevitably, the Bolsheviks would have ridden all over Europe. I mean, that's kind of inevitable. If there had been no Germany, because France couldn't have stopped them, if Germany had been some vassal state of the West, then the Soviets would have just steamrolled all over. There's a certain theory that came out in the 80s by pseudonymously by a guy named Viktor Suvorov, and he was a Russian KGB, and it's called the Suvorov thesis, and he argues that Stalin wanted to start a world war as a presage for global revolution. And then he would then, at the end of the war, come in with the Russian army and dictate the peace at gunpoint because everybody else would be too exhausted from the fighting. Now, that has taken a lot of flack from the neocon court historians, but such a view was actually shared by H.B. Liddell Hart in his introduction to the history of the Second World War, and is also shared by the economist Brian Kaplan and the historian, I can't remember his name now, but he was a leading scholar. Oh, Stanley G. Payne, the leading scholar of fascism. So the Soviets people don't understand this. In 1941, actually, in 1939 even, when the war started, the Soviet Union had the world's largest standing army. The Soviet Union had more tanks in 1941 than all of the world's armies put together, something like 10,000 armored fighting vehicles. They had something like 10,000 aircraft, bombers, fighters, the whole 9 yards. Again, larger than all the world's air forces put together at the time. And they had the world's largest standing army. I think it was as large or larger than China's as far as actual manpower. And you have to ask yourself, what was Stalin doing with all this? In fact, there's a very interesting recording you can find online where we have the only known recording of Adolf Hitler speaking in his normal tones, not ranting at a speech. It's just normal Hitler, by the coffee table. And he's talking to the Finnish Prime Minister Mannerheim. And they're talking about Stalin's military buildup. And they're both stunned at how much he was able to build up militarily since the late 20s. And I mean, people don't understand that the Soviet Union was on full military footing since the second 5-year plan in 1928. They were building the world's largest army at the time. And the really great failing of Western policy before, during, and after the war was that nobody saw the obvious threat of the Soviet Union. Its clear implications for conquest due to the Marxist dialectic and plan for world domination. Karl Marx famously said, you can't have communism in any one place unless you have communism everywhere. Because, of course, if you don't have communism everywhere, you have the potential for a reactionary government to overthrow you. So it's you have to have communism everywhere, but to have communism anywhere, which sounds very similar to the neocons. You got to have freedom everywhere, otherwise we're not safe at home. But nobody else except Hitler saw that threat. And we eventually had to realize that threat when in the late 40s, early 50s with Joseph Stalin. But that I think is the great failing of Western diplomacy. Nobody saw the clear threat for what it was. I mean, the Soviet Union was the size of 3 times the size of the United States. It had the natural resources of a continent. The idea that Hitler was a threat on par with Russia is ludicrous. I mean, Germany's this tiny nation with no oil and no rare earth materials for industrial processes. Russia is rich in oil, coal, lumber, natural gas, and strategic metals for industrial work. It's a completely different situation. And yet, one thing that's very common with the neocon narrative is it's just Chamberlain and the French and Hitler. Stalin isn't even in the discussion, even though clearly he's brooding and threatening the whole time. And of course, he invades Poland with Hitler.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different aspects to that are often overlooked. As far as what you're saying about the Soviet military buildup, as a lot of people know, when the rivalry between Stalin and Trotsky developed over who was going to succeed Lenin, one of the big controversies was whether they were going to build what they called socialism in one country, that is, build up and consolidate the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state, or whether they were going to try to immediately expand the revolution into other parts of the world. Now, Trotsky, who turned out to be the losing party in this, his idea was they wanted to have a worldwide communist revolution, and he wanted to have it as soon as they could make it happen. Stalin was a little bit more cautious about that. His idea was, well, we can't very well carry out a revolution if we're going to lose. There's no point in that. So his idea was he wanted to build up the Soviet state and the Soviet army, and so that it would be a much more formidable fighting force when the time came that they would have to engage the rest of the world in armed combat. And as you were saying, Russia was the world's largest country. It was a massive. The Soviet Union was a massive state. And if you look at an old map of the Soviet Union, just compared to the rest of the world, it was a massive territory. Now, parts of that territory were fairly sparsely populated, and other parts were really backward in terms of their economic and technological development. But it's still a massive territory with a lot of natural resources, as you were saying. But the ambition of Stalinism was to essentially militarize Russia and turn it into a standing army, turn the whole nation into a standing army. And that's what the Soviet Union largely was. I mean, it was not dissimilar to what we see in North Korea today, where their policy was army first. It's all about what the military and the armed forces need comes first. And if we've got anything left, like actually feeding people or anything, well, we'll get to that second. But of course, that's very in keeping with the personality of Stalin. I mean, all of the reputable biographers of Stalin agree on one thing, and that was that Stalin was an extremely paranoid person. He saw enemies everywhere, and he was just the type of head of state that would primarily orient himself towards building this kind of massive military force. And that's what they were essentially doing. I mean, that's what the Soviets were doing during that time period, during the 1920s and 1930s. And correctly, it was a serious threat to the surrounding countries, including Europe. Ironically, a lot of people don't realize this either, but when the build-up to the war was going on in the 1930s, that is when the build-up to the Western entry into the war, to the the entry of the English and the French and then the Germans. Then the Americans. It was the far left. It was the pro-Soviet left that was the most zealous proponents of entering a war against Nazi Germany. In fact, there were some people in the United States in the 1930s who referred to the zeal for war, the drive to war, as the Communist War, because in the United States, the Communist Party, the American Communist Party, was a very large organization. I mean, relatively speaking, it was a very large organization with about 1 million members, and it was a very zealous proponent of American intervention to defeat Hitler. And the reason why was because they saw the Nazi movement as sort of the last stand of capitalism. That's how the Stalinists interpreted fascism generally. They viewed it as capitalism's last stand. They viewed that, capitalism is going down in defeat, and they've recruited these fascist movements as sort of the strong arm of capitalism, and this is really the last stand of capitalism before the worldwide communist revolution comes. So the far pro-Soviet left was actually among the most zealous supporters of the intervention against Germany. But the question is, to what degree was Germany a threat to the rest of the Western world? It's clear that there was going to be a confrontation between Germany and France. I mean between Germany and Russia. There was no way around that, given the ideological nature of those particular regimes and the kinds of personalities they have. But the issue is, how could the other nations, how could the rest of the world have contained these particular regimes? And I think the obvious answer was to simply let them fight it out in Eastern Europe, in Eastern and Central Europe. Let the Germans and the Russians fight it out and wear each other down to the point where both of them were weakened to where they couldn't really expand beyond a certain level. Even today, we hear a lot of commemoration of World War II in the West about how, we Allies, we really gave it to the Germans during World War II, but it was really the Russians that gave it to the Germans in World War II. I mean, the Western European countries and the United States were really just bystanders when compared to the Russian war effort against Nazi Germany. So that was really the centerpiece of that particular war, at least in the European theater, was the battle between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia.
Yeah. Again, the problem that I see with the Munich fallacy is that they assume that if Hitler had been defeated at the Rhineland, then there'd be no war. Well, of course there'd be a war. There'd be a war with Stalin. It just would have happened sooner. But this time, though, if that had happened without Hitler, the Russians wouldn't have had these massive defeats that they were reeling from. They could just move from the get-go without any losses and just steamroll Europe. So really, they don't have an alternative to Stalin. And I think Pat Buchanan does. Used Hitler to contain Stalin. And of course, Hitler can't conquer Russia. Russia's got more than twice the population of Germany at that time. Its landmass was probably 50 times greater. It's a joke. I mean, the idea that Germany was a threat and Russia wasn't is just ludicrous. I mean, Germany had less than half the population of the United States or Russia. They had almost no natural resources. I mean, had coal and iron to make steel, but it didn't have any oil, which is the bread and butter of modern war. England, through its colonies, and then Russia and the United States had all the necessary resources for war. And National Socialism was not an internationalist movement. See, it's less of a threat than communism. National Socialism, Hitler said over and over again, is only for German people. Other forms of socialist governments might be necessary for the Italians and the French and the English, but it won't be National Socialism. And in fact, if you read Mein Kampf, he actually has great respect for the United States and Great Britain as Anglo-Saxon powers, the pure Nordic race and all that. So not only was he, would have been happy to just let us be and take out the trash with Stalin, his ideology wasn't global in context. And then we've already discussed the global nature of communism. And with the collapse of Nazism in 1945, we came to grips with the internationalist objectives of communism. And that led to a 40-year Cold War. And I think any sober, honest assessment would say that German National Socialism, as a threat geopolitically, as ranked towards Soviet Bolshevism, it's minuscule. It's like a drop of, it's like a drop in a pond.
Well, Germany had certain tactical advantages in the sense that they did have access to oil through Norway. They did occupy Norway, and that gave them access to oil there. And they had a steady supply of iron ore coming in from Sweden that actually remained neutral but on friendly terms with Germany. And as they conquered the Eastern European territories, that gave them a fair amount of slave labor and so forth they could use. So they did manage to build up a fairly formidable war machine as well. But the idea, though, that the West would not have been threatened with war, as you were saying, if the Nazis hadn't have been there, is ridiculous. I mean, can you imagine when the Soviets under Stalin started their westward advance, that if the Weimar Republic had still been in power in Germany,
there'd have been a speed bump. It would have been nothing. Right.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly, and all of the Eastern European countries would have been an even bigger joke. So if Nazi Germany hadn't have been there, the Soviets would have had just an open door to probably to spread the Soviet Union all the way to England if they wanted to, all the way.
Oh, yeah, easy.
Yeah, which, it was their goal. I mean, that was their objective. They believed that this revolution they were spearheading had to be global in nature, as you were describing, for the ideological reasons you were describing. And Hitler certainly regarded, the thing about the Nazi ideology is that because of the kind of extreme racial determinism that they subscribe to, everything began and ended with race. They thought, for example, that they would have a fairly easy time conquering Russia eventually, because they considered the Russians to be an Asiatic race that was an inferior race to the Nords, and they, as you were saying, had more regard for the Anglo-Saxon and Nordic people in Western Europe and in the United States. In fact, Hitler was very enthusiastic about the eugenics policies of the United States. He actually praised that in some of his writings.
Margaret Sanger actually had Nazi eugenicists write for her American Birth Control League in the 1930s.
Yeah, so it's not that Hitler and had a special dislike for the Western Europeans or the Americans, although some of that is mitigated by the fact that it was those states that had been responsible for imposing the Treaty of Versailles on Germany. And I did think he regarded avenging the Treaty of Versailles as one of the goals of the Nazi movement. In fact, even in Mein Kampf, he talks about how France needs to be destroyed for having been the ones that were responsible for the Treaty of Versailles. So I think, though, that Hitler probably had as a plan turning his sights on Western Europe once he got done with the Germans. I mean, once he got done with the Russians in Eastern Europe. I think that he had this vision of a Eurasian empire, Eurasian Nazi empire, where the other races would essentially be slaves to this Aryan master race. The Russians, the Slavs, the Poles, and I think he would have tried to conquer the Western European nations eventually as well, and install a puppet Nazi regime, like he actually did, like he did in places like Holland and Denmark and all of that. So I don't think that Hitler intended to fully live in peace with the Western European nations for perpetuity, but he certainly saw the Russians as the primary enemy. Not only were they the most formidable enemy in a military sense, but also in an ideological and racial sense. He viewed them as these inferior Asiatic peoples that are under the rule of these Jewish Bolsheviks, and that right there made them, the devil incarnate from the perspective of the Nazi philosophy. So I certainly think that was where he was headed with that. One other issue too is that it's often stated that because of the supposed failures at Munich, that the Holocaust was able to happen, that the concentration camps and extermination centers and all that were able to develop because Hitler wasn't stopped in his tracks. And I think that that's a misreading of history as well, because what happened when the Allies turned on Germany after the Polish guarantee failed, and the Germans turned around and occupied all of Western Europe, that essentially trapped the refugees, Jews and others, in those countries. All of the refugees that had fled Germany itself to places like Holland and France and elsewhere, all of a sudden were trapped in the places that they had fled to for safe haven. So if anything, it actually accelerated the racial extermination process that the Germans implemented. So I think the Munich, the Munich myth, as we call it, is inaccurate on that count as well.
I find it interesting that none of these neocons are ever worried about nipping Lenin in the bud to stop the Gulag, but that might just be the Jewish element of the neocon establishment. In fact, I have never read anybody in contemporary, not even the anti-communist Richard Pipes. I haven't read anybody that said, oh, well, the United States, which did deploy troops to Russia in 1918, 1919 to help the whites, well, sort of. That's a podcast for another story. But nobody talks about nipping Lenin in the bud. But the other thing is the entry of the United States into the European conflict. Now, or the World War as a whole, one of the two things that I think have to be pointed out. First of all, prior to World War II, and this is recorded by Herbert Hoover in his seminal work, Freedom Betrayed, which was posthumously released, I think, in 2014. Herbert Hoover documents that throughout the 1930s, there was massive Soviet infiltration of the U.S. government. And one of the most famous and top-level communist spies was Harry Dexter White. Harry Dexter White is famous because he helped create the Bretton Woods conference, and he was the U.S. Representative at Bretton Woods in 1944. But he's also famous, or he should be infamous rather, for his leaking of the Tanaka Memorial. The Tanaka Memorial was a communist forgery. The Soviet Union was afraid of a two-front war, and they did not want to fight Japan and Germany at the same time. and they wanted to embroil Japan in a war with the United States. So communist agents fed information to Harry Dexter White to convince the president to have a hard line on Japan. And what we saw was the Tanaka Memorial was a forged claim that the Japanese were going to build a large empire in Asia as a springboard for global domination. And we know it should have been known as a forgery when it was released, because Tanaka had not been the prime minister when it was released. It was actually released before he was prime minister and able to make such a claim, if such a claim he were to make at all. It's also interesting that Harry Dexter White sabotaged a gold shipment to nationalist China during the Civil War. But needless to say, this kind of Stalin's little birdie in the ear, if you will, was convincing the Americans to have a hard line against Japan. And it's actually a known fact that Japan would have accepted terms of withdrawing from Indochina and China in the summer and fall of 1941. And we know this from the American ambassador in Japan. I think his name is Joseph Grew. He wrote in his memoirs that Japan was acting in good faith with these negotiations. But he says also in his memoirs that Japan, we can't come to terms with Japan. We need that oil to go to war with Hitler. Of course, it's a specious and idiotic argument, because all the oil and blood and treasure wasted in the Pacific could have easily been spared had we just accepted the Japanese reasonable. They had two claims which were very reasonable. One, purchasing the backlog oil that they would have purchased had there been no embargo, and allowing Japanese soldiers to remain in certain strategic locations in China to contain communism. A threat that, as we should see at the end of World War II, with the removal of the Japanese Empire, was a very real threat. And in fact, the European powers that had stationed troops in China since the 1840s. So it's not really unreasonable. Even we had troops in China in the 1920s. Neither were unreasonable claims the Japanese were making. But see, we wanted to go to war in Europe with Germany, and to that end, Roosevelt had engaged in a series of illegal attacks on U-boats by U.S. destroyers, which Hitler, remembering World War I, did not want to bring America into the war, so he pretended they never happened. And since Hitler wasn't biting, they needed another way in. And Japan was that way in, because of the tripartite pact that the Germans had signed with the Japanese. And so by essentially shutting the door in Japan's face and rejecting their reasonable demands to withdraw from China and Indochina, we guaranteed a war in the Pacific, which guaranteed a war with Hitler.
Well, the Japanese were the situation there was somewhat similar to what happened in Eastern Europe with Germany, in that if we want to look at the idea of Japan somehow being a threat to the United States, in reality, the Japanese were moving to their west, not eastward towards the United States. The Japanese regime during World War II was a military regime motivated by a strong nationalist outlook. And their main concern was the fact that because Japan was an island, it had very little in the way of localized natural resources of its own. So their idea was, well, we'll just go take it from these other places. And they looked at it like that was legitimate, because they resented the influence of the Western imperial and colonial powers in Asia. Keep in mind, this was before the era of decolonialization, and you had Dutch Indonesia, you had the American colonies in the Philippines, you had the British imperial influence in China and places like that. So the idea that the Japanese promoted ideologically was that they were an Asian civilization that was liberating Asia for Asians, and they viewed it, they looked at it like, because they thought of themselves as the most advanced Asian civilization, that they should rightfully rule Asia. But the Japanese expansionism of that time period was concentrated in Asia and the Pacific. There's no evidence that they actually had planned on attacking or invading the United States at any particular point. In fact, in the events leading up to Pearl Harbor, as you were pointing out, the United States had imposed an embargo on the Japanese, and had essentially cut off their oil supply. And they did that in response to the Japanese occupation of Indochina, Indochina being the region that's now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But the Japanese very desperately wanted that embargo lifted because it was certainly a threat to their war effort as well as their economy and all of that. So it was certainly in their interest to try to have that, to form negotiations where that could be lifted. And the United States imposed pretty harsh terms on the Japanese during the course of that embargo. And what we now know from the historical record is that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it was essentially an act of desperation. It wasn't that the Japanese were building up this massive armed forces to go and actually sail across the Pacific and invade California. That's not what the Japanese military plan was. The Japanese believed that the U.S. had forced them into a corner with the embargo, and they figured that war with the U.S. was inevitable, and the only possible way they could win a war they were very skeptical of their ability to win a war with the U.S., but they thought that the only way they could win a war with the U.S. would be if they had a really good, really strong first strike, and that's what Pearl Harbor was. Their idea was, we're going to hit Pearl Harbor and try to take out the American Navy, and then maybe we'll have a fighting chance in an actual war with the United States. All of this was covered in a very interesting book that was published back in the 1990s called Isolationism Reconfigured. It was written by a scholar named Eric Nordlinger, and Nordlinger argued this fairly persuasively in this work, that the Japanese war effort against the United States in World War II was in fact an act of desperation that came in response to the terms that were imposed by the embargo, and that Pearl Harbor was this kind of, well, okay, if we're going to do this, we've got to roll the dice and see what happens. So there's no evidence there that that a direct confrontation between the United States and Japan would have been unavoidable. Now, there still would have been some tension. The fact that the Japanese saw places like the Philippines as part of their rightful sphere of influence would have put them into a direct conflict with the United States. There would have still been a geopolitical conflict there, but it's not necessarily apparent that it would have escalated into the kind of massive regional war in the Pacific that it was, after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, exactly. And as far as Pearl Harbor goes, was there advanced U.S. foreknowledge? Well, the simple answer is yes. In Time magazine in 1945, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War of the United States, recounts the lead up to Pearl Harbor. And he says that he met with the president to discuss the evidence of impending hostilities with Japan and the question of how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. I mean, that's the tried and true trick, Mexico, Fort Sumter. You let the other guy fire first, and then you blame him. But you see, Japan was backed into a corner during the Great Depression. The European powers, Britain, France, Holland, and the United States, had all embargoed Japan during that period. And there was no one to trade with, and Japan was economically not self-sufficient. See, one of the motivations for both Germany and Japan in World War II was this idea of autarky, economic self-sufficiency. They saw the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Empire, the United States, the British Empire, the French Empire, and they saw them as economically self-sufficient due to their colonies or their large territory. And Germany and Japan realized that if they wanted to preserve their interests in the future, they could not rely on the largesse of these great powers and had to build their own empire, if you will. In both World Wars, World War I and World War II, Germany invoked British India as the legitimate cause for their annexation of Eastern Europe. In Japan, in Asia, invoked the U.S. Meddling in Latin America. They said, look, Britain has India, the United States has the Monroe Doctrine in the Americas. Well, Japan gets East Asia and Germany gets Eastern Europe. And they were saying, well, you guys already got your slice of the cake. And it's very telling also that Germany and Japan did not want to make gains at the expense of the already existing Western empires. They wanted to make gains at the expense of China and Russia. Russia was a pariah under the communists, and China was, except for the United States, seen as the yellow peril, as well as Japan. And so they actually didn't want to directly confront the Western powers and dismember their empires. In fact, Pat Buchanan says in his book, Churchill Hitler, The Unnecessary War, when Singapore fell to the Japanese, it was noticed that Hitler was not happy and didn't, kind of had a low key on that. And he told his officers that, look, the Japanese, they're going to be in trouble in the future. We can't be too happy that Britain's falling, because again, he didn't want the British Empire to collapse. So it's the very imperial mindset of Britain, Russia, the United States, France, gave Germany and Japan the justification and the ideology to build their own empires, to become self-sustaining and able to defend their own interests. And with China, the United States wants to paint China as a victim of Japanese imperialism and the terrible depredations that occurred, which did occur. But, let's face it, East Asia has always been conquered and overrun by warlords as far back as the first emperor of China. The idea that you're going to have a choice between a rational humanitarian and some sort of violent warlord thug in East Asia is just not going to happen. It's like, well, pick your poison. And the communists, which took over China, killed more than twice as many people as the nationalists and the Japanese killed combined. So removing Japan was an absolute catastrophe. The Japanese were containing communism, and when the Japanese were removed, the dike burst and 70 million Chinese got killed.
Well, that's a really important point, and it's one important point that I've noticed a lot of people, even people on the right who are staunch anti-communist and view these kinds of issues from a staunch anti-Soviet perspective, they often miss that point when it comes to Asia. Like a lot of people, a lot of Western people will say, well, what did we really get for having defeated Hitler? Because look what happened. The Soviet Union went and annexed all of Eastern Europe and half of Germany, and then we had the Cold War and the arms race and everything there. So did things really turn out that well? But something arguably just as bad or worse happened in Asia. When Japan was defeated in Asia, what was the result of that? Well, you had the Communist Revolution in China 4 years later. 4 years after the Japanese surrender, you had the Maoist Revolution in China. The bloodiest regime in history came to power. That's not counting the people that were killed in the Civil War prior to that. And then when it came to Indochina, who was it that led the resistance to the Japanese in Indochina? It was Ho Chi Minh and all of these folks that spearheaded the communist revolutions in that region as well. Same thing with Korea. Who was it that led the resistance to the Japanese in Korea? It was Kim Il-sung. Because of the defeat of the Japanese, that's what happened to Asia. Asia fell almost completely under the domination of these really extreme communists, under Maoism, under Kimism, and under Hoism, and later Pol Potism. Those were the real successors to the Japanese. If by the Japanese having been removed from those regions, that's what you got in its place was all of that.
Well, exactly, and to be fair as well, Japan, after the Meiji Restoration of, I think it was 1867, Japan was a modern Western country. They had parliament, they had the rule of law. Japan was also a great admirer of the United States. Outside of the United States, Japan is the greatest fan of baseball. And so in many ways, Japan was a Western power, but like Germany, had fallen on tough times and had resorted to extreme solutions. Now, what the Allies should have done in the 1930s is, given that Japan and Germany, unlike Russia, which was beyond the pale under communism, and China, which was racked by warlordism and political corruption, were Western nations. And the Western powers in the United States and England and France should have looked at the more reasonable elements in those governments and then tried to strengthen them and meet the legitimate demands of the German and Japanese nations to help steel them against these more fanatical elements. Because again, Pat Buchanan points out the last president of the Weimar Republic said that, look, if you don't give me some of these demands about the German rights and people that want to come back to the motherland, you're gonna not have a democracy in Germany anymore. And you're gonna have to answer to a dictator, which is exactly what happened. In fact, the thing that I love about the neocon myth about Hitler is even up until Danzig, not a single one of Hitler's demands for territory were illegitimate based on self-determination. Whether it was the Rhineland, Austria, Sudetenland, or Danzig, every single one of those people, those German groups of people wanted to be a part of the motherland. So as a part of fatherland, I should say, it's the German word for it. So according to the neocon principle of self-determination, even up until Danzig, Hitler's claims were all totally legitimate. None of the people that were going to be affected by those changes, or very few, were unhappy with them. In fact, the vast majority were for those changes. And in fact, Poland itself had been oppressing the German minority in Upper Silesia, which was one of Hitler's casus bellis to invade Poland in the first place. And I think Pat Buchanan brings out a good point here. Poland itself was actually a military dictatorship and was, anti-Semitic and had also helped carve up Czechoslovakia in the partition in 1938. And really, this kind of gets to the mass insanity of the Polish leaders. Poland at the end of World War I attacked Russia. There was the Soviet-Polish War. They annexed tracts of Belarus and the Ukraine. And then, of course, they were ceded the Polish corridor in Upper Silesia from Germany. Now, you've offended the two superpowers of the region, Germany and Russia. And up to your dying day, you refuse to negotiate with either one. You don't pick a fight with the two biggest kids on the block and then not seek to then reach an accommodation with one of them. In fact, A.J.P. Taylor writes again in his World War, Hitler's demand of Poland was quite moderate. He only wanted rail access to East Prussia and control of Danzig. That was it. And of course, Poland would be incorporated into the anti-communist pact and would have been an element of Hitler's crusade against Bolshevism, just like Hungary and Romania. Yeah, this neocon talk that Poland would have been dismembered had it peacefully cooperated is baloney. Hitler didn't dismember Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, or Finland because they collaborated with, unlike Czechoslovakia, with this crusade against Bolshevism. And the Poles not only were a dictatorship, they were politically extremely stupid. I can't think of any leadership more stupid than the Polish leadership in 1939.
Yeah, well, one of the claims that it's often ignored as well is that when the neocons and others that think in that way talk about the expansionism of the Germans and the Russians into Central and Eastern Europe during that time, what they don't realize is that those regimes, or obscure, one of the two, is that those regimes that existed in that region were not they were not contemporary Holland or Sweden or something like that. They were not just these, easygoing Western liberal democracies. I mean, those were most of those regimes were dictatorships, or they had, in some cases, they even had a quasi-fascist government of their own, or they had a large communist movement and were in danger of a communist revolution of their own. So it's inevitable that most of those countries would have fallen under the rule of that kind of system anyway. Perhaps the Russians and the Germans sped it up a little bit, but it's not like these were regions of the world that were committed to, quote unquote, Western liberal democratic values at all. And obviously that wasn't the case in Asia.
Yeah. It's while it's lamentable that these artificial states were in such a position, there's nothing you could do about it. I mean, they were literally unreachable. The British could literally not in any meaningful way protect them. I also think that as far as who was the greater threat, who was the more dangerous or evil person, Hitler or Stalin, I think it's quite telling that except for Poland, every Eastern European country voluntarily allied with Hitler. Even Yugoslavia did. In fact, the reason why Hitler invaded Yugoslavia in the first place was that there had been a pro-Allied coup. Prince Paul was actually pro-Hitler. But of course, it was an Allied coup, and then Hitler had to invade to close up the Greek front, which Italy had opened up. But except for Poland, every other Eastern European nation voluntarily sided with Hitler. Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia until the coup, Bulgaria, Finland, the Baltic states. None of them, including Poland, voluntarily sided with Stalin. That, to me, speaks volumes.
Well, even when the Germans invaded the Baltic states, like Latvia and some of those places, they actually viewed the Germans as liberators. They thought they were being rescued by the Germans, because they had been under the rule of Stalin up until that point.
Yeah, exactly. They're really. I mean, it's hard to imagine how much of a pariah the Soviet Union was in the 30s. In many ways, it's analogous to North Korea today, except it's far more of a threat than North Korea ever could be. But there was a tremendous pariah status on the Soviet Union. And in fact, until 1933, the United States had no diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Now, Roosevelt had negotiated a treaty with Litvinov to recognize the Soviet Union. And of course, it just shows you how silly Roosevelt was. One of the clauses of the treaty was that Russia would have free and open elections, which never happened. Even in Roosevelt's lifetime, let alone throughout the Cold War era, it just never happened. And but again, the real short-sightedness that I see in both the neoconservative fairy tale but then the actual politicians of the day was the complete ignorance of the danger of the Soviet Union. I mean, love him or hate him, everything Hitler said about the threat of Russia was true. And we all learned that truth in 1948 with the Berlin airlift. Everything that he said about the danger of Bolshevism was true. And the United States spent 40 years containing that threat. Now, it boggles the mind why literally nobody seemed to be able to see it. For a time, Winston Churchill saw it in the 1920s, but he was blinded by his hatred of Hitler and the Germans to see that threat. In fact, it's probably apocryphal, but to attribute to the Churchill said, "We killed the wrong pig," after he heard about the death of Hitler.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that the Soviet threat or the Russian threat was never viewed in the same way as the German threat. I think there were a wide range of reasons for it. One aspect of that had to do with the fact that Russia had always been perceived of as being this backward nation, and I thought they just didn't take them quite as seriously as they did the Germans, which had been a very advanced nation. Also, the fact that the Germans had been the official bad guys in World War I think that also fed into that quite a bit. And then in the West, you also had a lot of people who were Soviet sympathizers as well. So all of those kinds of ideas, I think, converged, and I think that's a big part of why the Soviet threat wasn't taken seriously. But you're absolutely right in the sense that the Soviet regime was considered to be an outlaw criminal regime. It wasn't recognized by any other nation for quite some time after it existed. I mean, it was viewed the way, as you were saying, the way the North Koreans are viewed today, or the way the Pol Pot regime was viewed back in the 1970s. It was just considered a band of extremists and criminals and who were dangerous, and no one wanted to have any kind of relationship with them. And that did change over time, obviously. In fact, one of the negative consequences of the Second World War is the fact that the Soviet Union did emerge from that war as powerful as they did, in part because of the aid they were given by the Allies.
Yeah, that's true. We're running up on about an hour now, so I think it's time to wrap up part 1 of our discussion of World War II. We'll pick it up in part 2. It's Todd Lewis signing off.